risk. That's what I'm going to discuss here. What do you do if you leave your house and the sky seems to be getting a bit darker? You take an umbrella. Why do you do that? Well, because there's a chance of rain, and if it does rain, it will have an impact on your clothes because they're going to get wet and maybe you get the flu and so on. So this is actually risk management, and it can be automatic for us. Well, most of us. Once I was traveling in Thailand and I got a motorbike taxi, and the driver of the motorbike had a great safety device. He would play a video of the Buddha while he was driving me on the back. And I was not convinced, but he was. So this was his way of risk management for his job. And maybe it works for him. I'm not going to try it myself. Another example, let's say we have an owner of a building that has 10 apartments. So what would he do from a risk management point of view? Well, of course he will get fire insurance because that's a legal requirement, so he has to do it. He may install smoke detectors. He may install fire extinguishers. And so why again would he do this? Well, because some of these steps are easy to do. You don't want to be your name coming up in the paper and bad reputation that you're a bad landlord. You got peace of mind. You want to make sure that you're okay with the law as well in case something does happen. And you can sleep better at night as well. Okay? So this is an example of good risk management. Now let's look at another one where we have a construction site. So let's say we have a large construction site. And in each large construction site, accidents will happen. They just happen. So then what? Well, you can provide or take steps to provide first aid training and first aid equipment or kit or a room where people can go and so on. But then it's noticed, well, it's seen, it's known, that the site is really big and it's very remote, and it will take a long time for a doctor to get there or an ambulance to get there. So then you say, okay, well, we should have a nurse on site all the time, okay? And that will make it easier. And that gives you some contingency, or you're planning in some contingency from a risk point of view. Now, why do we do risk management? Well, by anticipating risk, actually, the project can save a lot of time and money. Let me give you another example. Suppose if you are organizing a big event for 800 people, and you notice there's a risk that the keynote speaker, the main one at the start of the day, will not be able to make it. So imagine only taking action on this at 9 o'clock in the morning of the event. That would be far too late. So we don't want to do that. So what would you do in case you had this kind of a risk or you noticed this? Well, maybe you can ask the person to arrive a day earlier. That would be a good idea. Okay, so there'll be no flight issues. Or identify a backup speaker, just in case, a good one. Or even replace the speaker with another speaker who doesn't have to fly in at that time. So risk management really helps increase the chances of project success. Doesn't guarantee it, it just helps increase the chances of project success, and that's why we do it. Now let me give you the definition of what PRINCE2 actually says a risk is. So a risk is an uncertain event or set of events that, should it occur, will have an effect on the project objectives. So will have an impact on the project. Now the project objectives we have already discussed, those are those benefits, costs, quality, sustainability. So if something does happen, we ask then, well, what effect will this have on the benefits of the project, the costs of the project, the quality of the outputs of the project? That's how to perceive this. Okay? So we're always trying to safeguard these project variables against a risk. Now, how do we measure risk? Sometimes it's nice to give a value to something. Well, there are two basic things we can consider. The likelihood or probability of the risk happening. So we're asking, okay, what percentage of chance do you think this will happen? And then we can say, okay, well, if it does happen, then what is the impact on the project? So we use likelihood and cost as an example. So the likelihood of a risk happening, let's say, is 33%. The impact on the project, if it does happen, it's going to be 6,000 euro, let's say. So we then multiply the likelihood by the cost, and we give it a figure of 2,000 euro. Okay, that's just a quick example. There may also, the same risk can have an impact, of course, on other project variables as well. So here I'm just focusing on the cost impact. Now, how does a project normally do risk management? Well, actually, risk management is ongoing because risk can appear at any time. At the start of the project, we are identifying risks. Risks are raised by project stakeholders during the project, and it's up to the project manager then to collect these risks into one place and to evaluate them. So look at the likelihood or the probability of the risk happening, and then the impact on the project. Once that's done and you have a full or a good idea on what the risk is and the impact, then and only then should you think about, okay, well, how to best to respond to that risk. And the most common responses are to reduce the likelihood of the risk happening or to reduce the impact if the risk does happen. Is that it? Not exactly. The project must continue to reevaluate risks always. So risk probability can change and potential impacts can change as well, the value of those impacts. So it's a good idea to continually reevaluate the risks as well. Now, can we give a risk value to the whole project? Up to now, I've mentioned we could actually give a risk value to some risks or to most risks. Yes, it's possible, and sometimes this is done. So, for example, a project can give a value to all of the risks one by one, and then what we do then is we can add these amounts together, and then we come up with a total for the whole project. So why would we need to do this? What's the value? Well, sometimes on the portfolio level and the higher level, they like to have a balanced overview of all projects which are happening. So they can say, well, okay, 10% of the projects of our investments can be high risk, but no more. So it's good to know then if maybe we have 20% of high risk projects, so they say, okay, stop that and bring a lower risk project in. So that's why we actually do it. Okay. Now, can a project stop due to risk, or to high level of risk? Well, I've actually just kind of answered that already in my last comment. Yes, it can. So if at the start of the project there's a 10% chance, let me give you an idea. So let's say we're doing a new investment and we expect to get a big grant from the government. And there's a 10% chance that the grant will not come through, but we have to start it anyway. And then after 2 months, we can now see that there's a 60% chance that we're not going to get that funding from the local government. So the risk is up. So we can decide, okay, it doesn't make any more sense anymore, so we should stop the project here. Now, let's look at the risk timeline of when we consider risk, or what do we do about risk during the project. So at the very beginning of the project, of course, the project manager will have a high-level overview, and they will note down some risks in their personal log file. Okay? But during the planning of the project, that's where they go into a lot more detail. So they will adopt an agreement document which describes how to follow up on risk during a project. And then they will start to collect risks from the different stakeholders and put these into a register file. Guess what the name of the register file is? A risk register. And then they will facilitate meetings to evaluate the risks. So they will invite the appropriate people into that meeting to help come up with suggestions on how to respond to these risks. Good. So there are lots of workshops or meetings depending on the amount of risk in a project in order to do that. And then during the project manager will continue to monitor risks, but they get help. So who do they get help from? Well, for each risk that they recognize, they should actually try to recognize what PRINCE2 calls a risk owner. So it's someone who keeps an eye on that risk for the project manager. So the project manager should not be looking at all of the risks, because probably they don't have access to the correct information. So it's good to identify people who will be able to see that much earlier than the project manager. Okay, so that's why we have risk owners. And what would happen then if the project manager identified a huge risk, a big risk? Well, then they would write a report on it, and this report will be given to the project board, and then they decide what to do with it. Okay, that's the best way to deal with that. So some last comments here. Risk management is really ongoing. It should be a really daily task for the project manager to keep an eye on. And it's important to note as well that risk management is really about being the project manager, being proactive in the project. And we can now see that having a good line of communication between the project manager and the risk owners really helps as well to keep an eye on risk and to monitor those risks on the project. Because if the project manager does not work with risk owners, they will have just too much work to do, too much administration to do. So it's good to work with risk owners. That's it for risk.